Welcome to the Long Thread podcast about spinning, stitching, and weaving by hand. The podcast is presented by Long Thread Media, publishers of Spin-Off, Handwoven, Piecework, and Little Looms magazines. Find us online at longthreadmedia.com. Treenway Silks is where weavers, spinners, knitters, and stitchers find the silk they love. Select from the largest variety of silk spinning fibers, silk yarn, and silk threads and ribbons at treenwaysilks.com. You'll discover a rainbow of colors thoughtfully hand-dyed in Colorado. Love natural? Treenway's array of wild silks provide choices beyond white. If you love silk, you'll love Treenway Silks, where superior quality and customer service are guaranteed. Knitpicks.com has been serving the knitting community for over 20 years and believes knitting is for everyone, which is why they work hard to make knitting accessible, affordable, and approachable. Knitpicks responsibly sources its fiber to create an extensive selection of affordable yarns like High Desert from Shaniko Wool Company. Are you looking for an ethical, eco-friendly yarn to try? Look no further than Knitpicks Eco Yarn line. Need needles? Knitpicks makes a selection for knitters right at their Vancouver, Washington headquarters. Knitpicks.com, a place for every knitter. I'm your host, Long Thread Media co-founder Anne Merrow. Kate Gagnon Osborn and Courtney Kelley are knitwear designers, authors, and teachers. Since 2008, they've owned Kelbourne Woolens, a yarn company and distributor. So, Kate and Courtney, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
So, you guys get to do something that I think of as every fiber artist's dream, which is like, you get to make yarn. You get to decide, this is the yarn I want. Can you tell me a little bit about developing new yarns and colors?
Well, you're asking this at a very prescient time because we're like in the thick of it right now with yarn development. I feel like it kind of comes in waves. But yeah, I mean, it's really just that. You think of the yarn that you wish you had in the world, and you think about the qualities of that yarn. And then you play around until you find the thing that you want. And then you have all these other parameters that you have to deal with, like, well, is the thing you want actually viable? Can the thing that you want actually be made by anybody? Can you get it in a reasonable manner and all that stuff? But I think a really key part of it is understanding what it is the fibers do, right? Yeah. To sort of build upon what Courtney said, because we don't actually produce the yarn. We're not a mill and we're not dyers, which has always been a little bit unique based upon both the size of our company and how we sort of the role that we play in the industry. So I think what Kate's trying to say is people either always think that we're hand dyeing every skein of our yarn, or they assume that we're making every single skein of yarn in our warehouse in Philadelphia. And neither are true. Yeah. So we don't mill or dye the yarn. So one of the things that we really, as part of every single part of the development process, the feasibility of the product and the long-term viability of the product are really important. And then also the pricing. So there are multiple, phases to it. It's like, what's the dream? What would be the most perfect version of this? And then what fibers can we access reliably? What colors can be produced reliably and consistently? And then at what price point can this be a viable product? In the past, we've designed super complicated, luxury yarns. We've designed super, classic, basic yarns. Our love, and I think where we really thrive and where we always strive to be, is a really quality product that is as accessible to as many people as possible, like under those parameters that we always have to be working with. I mean, there are yarns that we get that are the dream, and then we look at the way it's dyed, or we look at the way the materials are sourced, or we look at the price point, and it's just not possible to produce the product, which, it's always like a little bit of a bummer. But in the long run, we're always really happy with the choices that we've made and why. So once we get a yarn, then
all of the initial sampling, all of initial development happens with blank undyed fiber. And then once we settle on a yarn, then we get to do the color development, which you probably saw on my face. I just got really excited about, which is really fun. We do have sort of a brand palette and a brand color story that we work with. And this August, it'll be 16 years that we've been business partners. And I think we've known each other now for almost 20 years. The only time we've ever gotten into a genuine fight is over colors. Like, but
is it
we
red?
actually think it's
or
really...
is it orange? Is it green? Or is it blue?
It's orange. It's always orange and it's always green, but that's fine.
Sometimes it's red or blue. It's okay.
That's fine. It's fine. You know, we've had former employees who are like, I'm just gonna not come into work on Wednesday when you pick the new colors for Scout. We're like, okay, we'll see you Thursday.
It works
Missing
for
out.
us.
So are you relying on personal taste or color forecasts, or how are you deciding?
We just it's all vibes.
That is not true. We literally pulled up a color forecast when we were doing the new Mojave color. See, we're fighting about them again.
Okay. Yes, but we would never just do colors based on like, oh, well, these like 7 colors for fall are the colors. So do those colors. Which I think like other, not necessarily yarn companies, because I don't know how anybody else does it.
So we kind of take it from a couple different places. We'll look at the forecasting. We'll look at the color forecast for future years. For better or for worse, this industry is always like a season or two behind. So it is a little bit easier to look at that forecasting without having to think about, what could be. We can kind of see what is. So we do look at that. We look at the yarn itself. Like, what is this yarn doing? What is the purpose that this yarn is serving?
Yeah. What are people going to knit with it or crochet with it? What are they going to make with it? Is it going to be like a lot of kids stuff, baby stuff? Mm-hmm. Is this a sweater yarn? If it's a sweater yarn, you have to have like a million neutrals and blues because people only buy neutrals and blues, even though you have a stunning palette of colors.
And then we look at what is missing in the line. Like, where are there holes? Where are there spaces that could be filled that make the palette, like, overall as a whole really beautiful? And then also, if people want to make like certain things with the palette, what's missing? If something like our yarn Camper, which is a really wonderful color work yarn, it's a fingering weight, 100% wool, 2-ply heather. We have some paler heathers. We have some lighter colors in there that don't really function in the same way in our Scout, which is the DK weight. Like, a really, really pale pink in Scout isn't going to do well, but it's really wonderful in the Camper because it serves that purpose within really traditional color work patterning. So I guess, at the end of the day, it's a vibe, but it's not, we're not just like, I want pink. It comes from a bunch of different places, and then we always meet in the middle, and it's really fun.
I mean, we do have these conversations where we're like, I don't know why we picked this purple. This purple's just actually really ugly and I don't like it. And then the other person will be like, I don't really like purple so I don't care.
Yeah.
Do you want to pick a different one? And then we do that. So that's like the extreme, like, going on a feeling.
Yeah.
And like, at the other end of it, we're like, people are going to really want a bunch of these weird orangey browns, aren't they? Okay, we got to like find a bunch of orangey brown things because I guess that's a thing. And next year, everything in Target will be an orangey brown color, and then suddenly everyone is going to be like, I just can't get enough of this weird nutmeg sort of color.
Why do I like mauve pink so much?
I
It
don't
always
know.
makes me think of that scene from The Devil Wears Prada, where Meryl Streep's like, you like it because you were told to like it. Yeah. It's true.
So that kind of answer, it's neither is it, I know that this is what's going to sell and I don't care, nor is it like, I'm just going to make colors I think are pretty.
Yeah. I mean,
think
we're
it's
running a
little of
business.
both.
Yeah.
We always used to do this like minty green.
Love it. Love it.
Because it's like so pretty.
No one
and we
buys it.
finally, and we had it in like almost everything, and nobody ever bought it, and it was always the least like well-selling color, but we both really liked it.
Yeah.
And then we finally like pretty much retired it. We haven't completely retired it.
It's in a few different places, so
yeah.
Hmm.
Germantown and jade, pastel green, perennial,
mint. Yeah. I think at one point we have a few color books that we use just sort of like as a starting point. And I think at one point I did take that mint because I kept being like, what about this one?
Take that page out.
Yeah. Let's just not make this even
don't even look at that
possible
one
for you anymore.
So when you're looking at something like tweed, not only are you picking the main color, but then you're also picking what the sprinkles are.
Yeah, and that's
the most fun.
Yeah,
well, I like sprinkles.
I know. Now I want ice cream. No, I think in that sort of goes back to what we were, first talking about with something like viability, because we can do set standards created by the mill, and then we can do custom things created by us. So in order to have a viable product, you have to utilize both what's on offer and also make it your own. So how we do that successfully really, or if we do that successfully, determines whether or not the yarn is going to be successful. So, mill minimums really affect a lot of that process, and specifically the tweed colors. Really, it's always a little bit of a fine line between, well, we can just get this green, but wouldn't it be better?
Design our own green.
Yeah. And
then you
got a lot of green,
thousands of dollars deep.
Yeah.
Which is my favorite color, but does not sell well. People don't wear green.
Yeah.
I say that, we're going to get emails. I wear green. I wear a lot of green.
As we're all sitting here wearing black.
Speaking of kind of dream yarns, one of the stories I think is really cool is Germantown. And Courtney, I think this was a real passion of yours. So can you talk a little bit about Germantown?
Oh boy, here we go. Germantown is absolutely my passion project. I always really like the history of knitting and like learning about the history of knitting and yarn. And, you get those old like Weldon books of knitting or those old Columbia pattern books and stuff. And they all call for Germantown. And at some point, I made the connection that the yarn called Germantown was called Germantown because it was made here in Philadelphia in the neighborhood Germantown. And so then I went on like a real deep dive on like, what is the story of that yarn? Where did it come from? And like, it's a deep well. It's a deep well of information and like very much tied to the founding of our country in this really wild way, and like very much a part of the initial movement from cottage industry to industrialization in the US, which is just like a really interesting and fascinating lens to look at history. Like, when were you able to walk into a shop and buy yarn with a label on it? Well, the first yarn that you were able to do that with ever was Germantown. And that's just so cool. And it existed as a name brand up until the 90s. The last company to make it was Brunswick, which is no longer in business, but you can still find fairly recent Brunswick patterns. And like if you have your mother or your grandmother's like old knitting basket, there's probably some Brunswick stuff in there. Coates and Clark, who makes Red Heart. They make a lot of lovely yarns, but I would say like that's the one we all are like, oh yeah, Red Heart. They last owned the Germantown trademark and they let it last. So we bought the trademark in 2016 or 2017, kind of just because I wanted to try to do something with it. And through happenstance, I met somebody at a Craft Yarn Council event who owned a mill. And I was like, do you make any wool yarns? And he was like, no, we just do acrylic. And I was like, but would you? And thus it was born. And so I went down and I visited the mill and I took an old skein of Brunswick Germantown and we chatted about it and he knew how to make it and he helped us source some U.S. wool that was probably the wool that was most likely used. It's called territory wool or territorial wool. And it just means wool of a certain quality from west of the Mississippi River. So it's a bunch of different breeds. Polypary, Corriedale. I don't know. But so it's very crimpy. It's very lofty. It's very bouncy. It's a really nice, round, toothy wool, but that's soft. And it feels like this sounds so dumb. It feels like what I remember knitting with wool to feel like. That's not dumb at all, though.
I mean, I think that's part of the whole story and the whole picture of it is understanding and appreciating the history of it and the manufacturing process. And I mean, there's the good and bad of everything, but then also the memory. I mean, I think the number one email we got from people was, oh my gosh, I remember this yarn. And I think it was also really important. The put up is a little bit different. It's in that tube kind of skein and it's a center pull. It's a skein that you really commonly see at craft stores, but we wanted that look not only for honoring the legacy of it, but also because it is such a classic product and it is something we wanted a lot of people to be able to recognize and use. There's a much lower barrier to entry because you don't have to wind the hank into a ball. So we could have done it in a twisted hank, but it just wouldn't have been the same. So, it's probably also the thing we get the most weird feedback about, but we're very committed. We're very committed to that part of it as well.
I think it is.
I mean,
on the shelf too. I mean,
it looks so great on the shelf.
It does
look so good on the shelf, and it's the alternative for a lot of things. Is like a donut ball, which is my nightmare. Well, they fall over, they become unraveled, they get all tangled. It's just like a mess. And then there's this sort of that 3-point skein, I think it's called, which is like the bullet skein. That's like kind of Skipper, our cotton is one of those like little roundy guys, but they're short. Mm-hmm. So they're sometimes, especially in 100-gram worsted weight skein. Kate and I met at a yarn store, so we think a lot about merchandising. Like when we make a product and we have to put it into a shop, we try and be really thoughtful about like what it's going to look like, because it matters hugely as to whether or not like it's going to be successful in your shop. Mm-hmm. But so if it was one of those like smooshy skeins, the like rounded bullet skeins, when you fit it one deep, it's not long enough on the shelf. And if you fit them too deep, they're slightly too long on the shelf. Then you can't put enough of them out. Mm-hmm. Anyways, it's actually perfect. Is that helpful? But I do think like what Kate said, I always wanted the yarn to be recognizable to a person who walked into a local yarn shop, possibly for the first time, who had only ever bought yarn at a big box store, who was like a little intimidated, didn't really know what they had just walked into,
And it was just like, oh, I'm good. I'm just going to look around. If they see Germantown on the shelf, they know what it is. They know what to do with that. You know, like you see a twisted skein, it's like a little intimidating. You don't really know what that is. You don't know what to do with it. Do you knit from it? Do you have to wind it into a thing? How do you do that? And then you have to talk to somebody about it or like engage with a shop owner or employee in a different way. And you're already intimidated. And I just wanted something that allowed people to belong in a place and feel like they were like, yeah, this is what I'm doing. This is what I want. This is my yarn.
The funny thing about Germantown is that it was not only a brand name, it became sort of just a word that people used for a certain property of yarn, for a certain quality of yarn. When I was speaking with Mikhail Begay, who is a Dene or Navajo shepherd and weaver, they mentioned that a lot of the rugs that were made in a previous generation used Germantown yarn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that yarn was just worsted spun, 100% wool that was spun in Germantown, Pennsylvania. It was the yarn that the U.S. government was purchasing. They purchased it for like military uniforms and a bunch of other things, and then they used it to trade. So there is an aspect to the history of Germantown that is complicated because Native people were moved off of their land, which meant they had to leave their flocks behind. And they did not have land that was like suitable for grazing, but they were weavers. And white people recognized that those weavings could be a good tourist industry. So they supplied them with the yarn they had, which was Germantown. It's not a great part of our history as Americans.
I think that that's kind of emblematic, though. I mean, it's our yarns are us, right? It's...
Yeah.
And, I think that now there's kind of an opportunity for redemption. So you're working with American wool and American mills. Some people really value things that are made in America, but there's also just the preserving of smaller, not massive industrial scale yarn production, wool production.
Yeah. And it's walking this fine line. It was really important that Germantown was made in the U.S. and made with U.S. wool in order to tell the story of Germantown. But in order to do that and have it be viable, which kind of goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, like I don't think, and Kate doesn't think it's just not a good business practice. It's not a good environmental practice to like be shipping wool and yarn and things, all over the country and back and forth. And so finding a mill and a supply chain for the yarn that was big enough and wasn't so piecemeal. I don't know if I'm explaining that well.
Well, part of just what we keep going back to, the idea of the viability of the yarn and the feasibility of the product and the cost of all of those different steps. Finding domestic production, unfortunately, it's not going to happen in Germantown, Pennsylvania anymore, but finding domestic production that can source the wool, dye the fiber, spin the yarn, finish the yarn, and label the yarn was
in
vital.
one place
Was vital to making Germantown possible. And
otherwise it would be a $28 skein of yarn. And that isn't
half of which would be shipping.
But
like
it's
the process of the shipping, like A, B, C, D, E, that's steps. Yeah.
I mean, and it just doesn't fulfill the mission of Kelbourne Woolens, which is, creating quality, affordable yarn. Like that is what we want to do. It has to fit within a price range where, you want to make a sweater, you can do that for under $100, under $50 in some cases. It can't just be because that's what we want. You have to find a way to make it viable and to make it work and to make it fit with what you're trying to do.
I think it's interesting that the yarn store you guys met in was Rosie's Yarn Cellar, which was Lisa Meyer's store. And Lisa has gone on to be the U.S. distributor of Manos del Uruguay. So all of you guys are really familiar with standing in the store trying to help somebody who wants to make a thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the worst thing is having somebody come in and want to do something and have them leave empty-handed.
So I think that's actually one of the interesting things about Germantown is that it's kind of like it's a happy note in the middle of a sad note. You know, we see that there are mills closing and dye houses closing and yarn stores closing. And there's also this, we're going to, at the same time, not only, you know, either bring something back in the case of Germantown or you know, develop something new.
Yeah, that's a really lovely way of putting it.
Oh, shucks. So we started by talking about knowing what fibers would do and sourcing fiber. And you guys mentioned that you've known each other for almost 20 years. I actually met Kate before you guys met because Kate was in my knitting group in Boulder and you were taking a spinning class from Maggie Casey.
Yeah. Who every time I've seen her since then have been like, do you remember me? And she always says, yes, Kate. Driven that poor woman completely insane. But yeah, I mean, that was great. I actually tried to work there, but I didn't get hired. Yeah, it's funny how we both, you know, where we both started out in Boulder. I was only in Boulder for such a short period of time, but it was a really, you know, it's what motivated me to apply to graduate school. And then I worked at the yarn shop. It was just on Sundays. I just needed a little bit of, you know, petty cash when I was in grad school, and I needed something to do that wasn't grad school. And then that's where I met Courtney, and then here we are.
So I think of you as being such a knitter, but am I right that your graduate school was actually a weaving program?
Yeah, I loved weaving. Love it.
Do you do any weaving now?
I try.
I know you have two children of various ages. So.
Yeah. Yeah. I've woven, you know, on and off. It feels, there's only so much, you know, there's only so much, but I don't have anything on the loom right now, unfortunately, but I hope that changes really soon.
Did you learn to weave as an undergrad?
Yes. Yeah, I did weaving in undergrad. I did weaving, like screen printing, knitting, stitching, but I did a lot of my undergrad was weaving. Yeah. But like art with a capital A. But I was 18, so it wasn't very good. But I learned a lot of...
Well, Kate's weaving instructor at Skidmore was friends with my weaving instructor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago.
That's true.
So we both, as undergrad, halfway across the country from one another and not knowing each other, we're both making embarrassing art weaving.
Hey, I didn't say mine was embarrassing. Mine was just bad. No, there's a difference. There's a difference.
Courtney, I did not know that you had a weaving background.
Yeah. We actually have a loom in the warehouse too.
We do. We got to get it set up. But I went to undergrad at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and I went initially for painting, which was great and fine and lovely. And then I just, on a whim, I took a weaving class, and I loved it. I absolutely loved it.
So what did you like to weave?
I feel like I spent a semester just sort of trying to figure out what the looms could do. And I took this weaving class. I totally fell in love. I was super enamored. And then the following semester, I think I only took one painting studio class. And then I took another weaving class and then also an embroidery class. Like I just was like, I think fibers is actually the thing. And one of the first things I remember doing was I learned how to do double cloth, and I did these weavings. And so it was open on one side, like a pocket, and then closed on the other side. And it was just like a strip of black cotton with these little pockets, these sort of like 4-inch pockets in it. And then I hung them all around the room like a strip, and I filled them with dirt and seeds, different kinds of seeds.
Of course you did.
Yeah,
did they grow?
It was really gross.
Did you water them? Did they grow?
They grew and then they rotted.
So neither of you approached weaving as a functional textile?
No.
So I don't have art degrees. I have science degrees. So I was like a little more Courtney's path in undergrad, but then for grad school, the program was set up where it was a very like practical education. It's in a neighborhood in Philadelphia, which up until, the mid 19th century was surrounded by mills. So a lot of it, it was an answer to the industry in Philadelphia. So a lot of the courses were geared towards like practical application. So chemistry classes, dyeing and finishing classes, what they call like knit technology and weave technology. But it's, I can look at any knit structure, not any, but knit structures and weave structures and warp knit structures. And then they're called pickouts, where you can then basically write a formula of how to reproduce the fabric and then determine how many yards of yarn you need to make X yards of fabric. And so a lot of the studio work was geared towards like end use. We talked a lot about end use. What is the point of this fabric? All of the uses of the fabric, but then their like practical functionality. So a little bit more like that. But I do struggle with that with weaving a little bit. Like there's only so many home goods you can make. So how like you could build gardening pockets. You could definitely do that. But yeah, I do a lot of garment sewing. So I'm always interested in the idea of creating like woven fabric for garment use. It's a fine line, both between, how many ends per inch do I really want to work with here? If this is actually just for fun.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's real.
So Courtney, did you go on to do embroidery after that art school class?
I have done embroidery. I did. So after art school, I did an embroidery class and I like incorporated some embroidery stuff into like other classes. And I did a really fascinating costume design class when I was in college, which I really like. Yeah, I feel like if I were a different person or if I had like a life again, I want to be one of those people who does embroidery for like costume design, recreating this 15th century ball gown. And so I have to go in and do You're the person that it says, this took 10,000 hours to recreate that. But now in my current life, I would sit down and figure out how to do it and then be like, okay, you 10, come over here. I'm going to show you how to do this. You 10 girls, come here. I don't want to do this anymore. And when I moved to Philadelphia, I did not move to Philadelphia for grad school. That probably would have been a better choice. But I followed a boy to Philadelphia. But I got a job at this place in Philly called the Fabric Workshop and Museum. I did an apprenticeship there, and they do a lot of screen printing. And then I worked there for a while. I made other artists' art, is like kind of how I would describe it. It was sort of like fine art fabrication. So I did work on some embroidery products with that and some sewing stuff. And I did some weaving. It was like a little bit of everything. They would get these sort of, artists would come in. They would basically like work with artists and they would come in and be like, what do you want to do with like fabric? What's your vision? And then the artist would like sort of, they would have a grant to like create this like thing. And then they had this studio of, there would be like a project manager and then like a bunch of minions. And I was one of the minions. You're like, okay, she wants to do it this way. So we're going to like sew all of these things this way. Yeah. And that was sort of the period in my life. I worked at Rosie's Yarn Cellar. I worked at the Fabric Workshop and I also cleaned houses. And I was just sort of trying to figure out what I was doing. Was I going to try and figure out a way to like be an artist, or was I going to have a job?
And the answer was none of the above.
Yeah, it was kind of neither. I think it was probably closer to have a job. I don't know that other people would think of it that way, because then I was like, oh, I'm going to start my own business.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, according to our like undergrad art programs, Kate, we both succeeded in having jobs in our field.
Yeah.
Which when you graduate with a BFA, that's like, wow. Boy. Yeah. You made it.
Yeah. I consider what we do as having a job.
So Philadelphia, it seems like, is a really kind of important partner in all this, both in terms of inspiration and education and community, because you guys have a retail store, and then Wild Hand is not too far from you, and they have a retail store. And so it seems like Philadelphia is this sort of like fiber and knitting hub.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I think, Philly's obviously a large city, but it's made up of a lot of small neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. And each neighborhood really has its own feeling and community. And it's a city, it sounds kind of cliche to say, but it's a city with such history, and then the textile history, which I think it does guide a lot of people's, goals and perceptions and ideas. And it's also a city that is quite affordable comparatively to a lot of the other cities on the East Coast where we are. So you can be somebody in their early 20s who has, a couple part-time jobs, but also is an artist. Someone who works for us works 4 days because he's also an artist. So he's able to really dedicate a lot of the time that he wants to his art while still having, this sort of set he's someone I think who just really likes the idea of the consistency. So I think it lends itself well to people both being able to take a chance on a small business, and also people who support and value small business and creativity. And where we are now, we're in the Mount Airy section of Philadelphia, which is a historically diverse and artistic community. And, we've been this is our fourth location, I believe, as we've grown and changed. And this is the first location with it's like a little warehouse store, little retail store. And it's been really great. It's been a really wonderful community. Up the street, there's 2 fabric and sewing stores. There's some really cute boutiques that have opened up. There's 3. There's 3 now. Yeah. And there's the one that she does like classes and teaching. She's like a pattern. There's a lot, and it's been really great. We're in a super crafty area. Yeah, real crafty.
Fun. I like it. Philly just had a ton of textile manufacturing, like from the beginning. Philadelphia was founded by a bunch of weavers from Germany. Mm-hmm. So they just could never get rid of it. But there's like a strip downtown on 4th Street called Fabric Row. And it's all real old school fabric stores, interior decoration and like garment manufacturer fabric stores, not like a quilt shop, but like bolts of 17 different colors of like silk charmeuse or something. And that is amazing. But somebody was in the other day and they were like, I feel like Mount Airy is becoming like another Fabric Row, but like for people who just like sewing.
Yeah.
And then there's like multiple yarn shops and everyone who comes in, like the first few months we were open, people would come in and be like, oh my God, I can't believe you're here. I live around the corner. Or like, I live a block away. I knit all the time. It's like everybody in Mount Airy, I think, crochets in the everybody. Kind of wild.
So this is probably the first time you guys have worked in a yarn store since Rosie's. What are you learning from having a retail store?
Personally, emotionally, or from...
I meant for the business. Are you finding that people who come in are... When you picture your customer in your mind, is that who walks through the door?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like, it kind of like makes us like feel really good.
Yeah, it's really validating.
Yeah, because it does show that the goals that we have and the approach that we're taking and the messaging is at least working, for some people. And I do think some of it is the neighborhood that we're in, but it's a really diverse population, age, gender, race, craft, style, skill, and that's really great because it shows us that the goals that we had when we first started producing yarns under the Kelbourne Woolens brand, there is a customer. There are a lot of customers and a lot of different customers for the product, and our goals for the product is working. So that's definitely good. And they do. I mean, I think we talk about how we worked in a yarn store, but we worked in a yarn store before social media existed. I still remember the day the first customer came in and said, "Oh, there's this website called Ravelry. You can't get on it yet, but you can add yourself to the list."
Wow.
So
I worked in yarn shops for like 5 or 6, maybe more years before Ravelry existed. Like, so we say, like, somebody came in the shop yesterday and I got to show her what Ravelry was. Cute. But she was so psyched. But I think, we say, oh, we've been working in a yarn shop, but a lot can change in 15 years. Yeah. So it is really good to just stay connected with the community in a different way and hear different perspectives and learn. We notice trends, not necessarily things that are trendy, but a lot of people are coming in and asking about this, or are saying, oh, I really want to make this type of thing. We see those patterns. And that, I think, in the long run, actually helps us serve our retailers better, and it helps us serve the yarn shops better that we wholesale to, because we can point out certain things to them, like, hey, a lot of people are knitting this sock, or, these are great yarns that work for socks, or a lot of people are coming in and saying they're going on vacation and they're bringing a sweater project with them because they know come fall they'll want that to be done. So we're able to guide our marketing and our product development and color development. That's one other aspect that informs our approach. And I think it only benefits everyone.
Both of you were sort of knitwear designers before you were yarn designers. Does how you design garments affect how you design yarn?
I think how we design yarn affects how we design garments. Our knitwear designing was very specific to Rosie's and very specific to, well, we have this yarn in the shop, knit something out of it. I mean, I think the first thing I ever designed was a hat in Koigu because we had Koigu in the shop. And you're like, oh, we're featuring Koigu. We used to get these millins. So we are very cognizant, it's not going to serve anyone if you have 100-gram skein of finger weight yarn and you knit something that calls for 5 grams of 12 colors. No one, unless you're providing minis, or unless you're kitting it, or unless you're doing something, because it's not useful for the shop. It's not useful for the customer. They're not going to do that. So we do really think about the viability of a design, not just, oh, I really want to make this and wear this. And I think the more you knit and the more things you try and the more things that fail, the more you learn. So back to what we were talking about in the beginning, with different fibers have different properties. And so, just because a sweater pattern says it needs this many stitches per inch, you can get X number of stitches per inch across a wide variety of yarns, and they won't all be good for whatever you're making.
Yeah.
And so that you just have to kind of know. But I think one thing we do know is we don't like floppy yarns. Or don't like drapey, floppy, limp yarns.
So we're probably not going to be seeing 100% silk yarn from you guys soon?
I don't think you're going to see 100% silk. No, it's so beautiful. But I don't think you're going to see a lot of alpaca. Some alpaca is nice. Yeah, a little alpaca. But it needs, I always feel like it needs something with it to give it life.
I'm always cold, so I also need a sweater that's functional. And I think for better or for worse, someone could see what we're saying as being really limiting or being stifling to the process. But I think I do, we think about end use a lot and we think about functionality a lot. I'm going to make a sweater, it has to keep me warm and it has to last because I don't have time.
Mm-hmm.
So it has to be something that fits with a lot of different, like it can't be a one-off. I can't have this one sweater that only works with this one dress underneath or one pair of pants or 4-degree shift in temperature, either too cold and it's non-functional or too hot and I'm dying of heat stroke. So that informs quite a bit. I need long sleeves. I need a cardigan that closes. I need seams. For better, for worse, it does affect what we produce for sure. Yeah. And I think we're sweater knitters. I like knitting garments. I like making garments. I like wearing sweaters. I think all of our yarns are good sweater yarns.
But you have a whole series of hats and mittens, like a whole year's worth.
People love to make hats. We do have a lot. People will just endlessly knit hats. I love knitting hats.
Hats are great.
I 100% agree. Like, well, a hat is a good swatch. That's how I use a hat. Yeah. I don't wear hats, but you knit a lot of hats. I do knit a lot of hats. My kids have a lot of hats.
Lucky kids. One of my colleagues, Pat Olsky, who's the editor of Piecework, met you guys recently at an event for Faroese wool.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of feel like this Faroese yarn is having a moment. And I was going to ask you about that because you've been the distributor of Navia, which is this Faroese yarn for several years. Do you feel like it's kind of having a moment?
Yeah, I think we said it was happening 4 or 5 years ago. And that was like kind of put a damper on our ability to import the yarn. They closed their borders for a number of years. We couldn't get more yarn, basically, is the moral of the story. So everything kind of got put on pause. And then just in this past year, we have been working more closely with them kind of behind the scenes to get their more up-to-date pattern books translated into English. That's a project Kate and Paola, who is part of the Navia team, have been working on kind of behind the scenes. And so lots and lots of patterns have been slowly being added to Ravelry. And then there was the event that we saw Pat at Scandinavia House in Manhattan. Was 5 years ago? 2 months ago? Or yesterday. But that was an amazing event. There was a lecture and then there was an exhibition of fashion, like sweater designers, and Navia was exhibiting there too. And it was really great. It was a totally full house. Isabella Rossellini was the moderator of the panel discussion that happened, which was incredible.
She's very woolly.
She is very woolly. I went up to her afterwards and I slipped her a skein of Germantown. I was like, I thought you might like this. No reason at all. I just thought you'd like to have this. But we have a lot of exciting new stuff coming for fall of 2024 from Navia that we're sort of getting organized right now. We have sales reps in the US who visit local yarn shops kind of all over the country. And so we send them sales materials, sample skeins and color cards. And so we're getting all that stuff organized now. And yeah, I feel Scandinavian style and especially their knitting history and their designs, I think are just really appealing. Their designs are so well crafted and they're so thoughtful and they can only be knit. It's not just, this is just a fashionable sweater. It's no, this is very intentionally designed knitting that has a history and an interest in color and life and all of these things that speak very much to the people and the place and the animals. And I think the Faroese yarns in particular do that because similar to Iceland, their sheep are so specific, and the fiber and the sweaters that are made by the people from their native sheep are unlike anything that you see anywhere else. It's really interesting.
And Faroese shawls are so classic. My husband got me a ball of Navia for my birthday.
Yes,
and so
he did.
I am trying to find the perfect Faroese shawl that will just fit right over my shoulders.
Oh, so for people who aren't familiar, the Faroe Islands are a tiny, tiny, tiny little group of islands. Not specifically, but if you think about it geographically, they're in between Iceland and Denmark. If you think about that part of the Atlantic, they have a connection to Denmark, but they've always maintained an independence, but being so remote and being in such a specific landscape, they've always really maintained their own identity and their own culture. And you see that in the knitting, but they also kind of a weird parallel to what we were talking about a little bit with Philadelphia. They've always viewed textiles and embraced textiles, but they have a modern look and approach and feel. And one of the goals of Navia is there are more sheep on the islands than people. And one of the goals of the company is to use the wool for the sheep in a way that both benefits the economy and the people and the animals. So a lot of times the wool previously was going to waste. The owner of Navia, his name is Chris Torkelshege. I think I didn't butcher that too badly. He comes from a family they owned a mill, they made yarn for generations. And by the time he was coming up, they no longer had their own mill. And it's sort of been a goal of his to kind of bring that back. I think the thing that he does that I find so admirable is that he has just worked very, very closely with the Faroese government to find a way to make the wool production on the Faroe Islands a strong economic engine for the island through both his yarn and by supporting designers like fashion designers and, all kinds of other like wool-based industries, including like insulation and carpet making and like all these other things, laundry detergent from lanolin.
Of course, yep.
But it's just really admirable. I mean, I love that you see a problem and you're like, well, we should do something about this. And I think he said that last year, Navia was the largest buyer of the Faroese wool. The government now buys all of the wool and then they sell it at auction to other people. And he said his company bought the majority of the clip for their yarns, which just shows. They also have their own line of ready-to-wear finished garments. They invested recently in Shima, which Kate is very familiar with too. It's a knitting machine, but it's like a whole garment knitting machine. Yeah, they're so cool.
Also, with their connection to the other Scandinavian countries, and particularly Denmark, a lot of the young people will leave the islands for college. But because they really value community and education, they can go to school for basically free and get stipends, not just Faroese, but just in Denmark. And so it really enables them to go back home and pursue businesses or companies or hobbies even a little bit easier. So we were able to meet quite a few designers from Tórshavn, the capital, who utilize the traditional methodology or the traditional techniques or traditional wool, but in really unique modern ways. So we're really excited to see what continues and what transpires. And soon, it was something they were talking about. We visited the islands in 2018, and then they were talking at the time about direct flights from New York, and supposedly that's happening really soon. So you will now be able to fly direct there, which wasn't possible before. So that is very exciting. And hopefully, it's always a balance. I'm sure people in Iceland have feelings about it. The balance between the tourism and the popularity and preserving what makes a landscape so unique and beautiful and wonderful. And so that will definitely be something we're going to keep an eye on for sure.
And once that direct flight is happening, I feel like we got to schedule a trip. It's a neat place, unlike anything.
It is beautiful.
It's beautiful. And they have great yarn and very cute sheep.
Oh my gosh. Remember when we were touring the island with Chris and we were driving on the road and I think we actually were stopped at a gas station or something, and we saw this truck drive by and it stopped at the stop sign and then kept going. And then right after it, there was this huge herd of sheep that just
like
sprinted down the road after the truck. Yeah, like following the truck. Chris said, oh, that's their farmer. So the sheep saw the guy's truck, recognized them, and we're like,
he said it was dinner time.
Dinner.
He was coming to feed them.
Yeah, they just chased the guy down the road. They're like, we're coming. That's, very cute. Very, very cute friend.
So the summer is actually when folks in the yarn industry think about what's coming up in the fall.
Mm-hmm.
So what's coming up next?
Oh my gosh, we're so busy.
I always think that this time of year, we're going to have all of this time to do the million things that we haven't had time to do because it was like the busy fall winter season. And we're always just as busy because you're doing all of the prep for fall.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
I think the big thing that's happening this fall is sort of the relaunch of Navia and also BC Garn.
Mm-hmm.
Like we've reestablished those post-pandemic cooperations.
And then Kelbourne, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 yarns that are currently in development. We tend to not release more than 1 yarn a season. So they're all in very different stages. One, we're expecting color, actual knit and crochet quantity sampling of 1 and colors to arrive next month. 1, we have to pick colors. 1, we're waiting on samples for the mill. So we have a kid sweater collection coming out in Skipper very soon. A really, really fun vintage inspired crochet Germantown collection. And then we're going back in time a little bit and revisiting some of our like beloved classic designs. And, we were having a conversation yesterday and Courtney was like, all those sweaters have like really drastic waist shaping. We should probably take that out.
Yeah.
So we're going to
pulling out sweaters from like the pattern archive. And I was like, oh, this is a great design. Everything was much too long. Just the bodies of sweaters used to be longer in the aughts and more fitted.
Yeah.
So we're let's take these 4 and then add 2 to 4 inches of ease across the body and make them 4 inches shorter. And then I think we're good. So
it's funny because you're not doing trendy yarns, but you have to be at least somewhat aware of trends in your pattern support.
Yeah. Or at least cognizant of what exists in the world. I wouldn't say, one of the things I used to kind of say all the time when we were asked about what our approach was that we know and have never, ever tried to be and never will be the most popular kid in the room. But that kind of goes against what the main thesis or goals of the company are. And the idea is we use the word classic a lot, but in the way that it has a lot of longevity and it has a slight timelessness to it that just looks familiar. So, we'll see little jumps or features or tags and things. It's like, oh, that's kind of a blast from the past. But that's almost how we know that something is successful because it's consistent. So trying to find that balance between giving the people what they want, but also kind of staying true to our style and our goals.
Yeah. And so with the yarns, I think it's just a matter of, we always do this thing. We have a lot of things in development, and whichever things get done first, get launched first. So we don't follow a standard season schedule. Like we do try.
Yeah.
But also it's sort of, well, but this one's ready. So let's just do this one.
Do you want it?
Do this one and see, and then you end up with just suddenly out of nowhere, a bunch of solid colors of Scout because it was just the right time, even though we've been talking about it for like 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
So if people want to go check out your yarn and they're not lucky enough to live in Philadelphia, you actually have retailers all around the country that they can go stop in and check out your yarn.
Yeah, we have a retailer map on our website, kelbournewoolens.com. And you can always, if you have a local yarn shop that you love that doesn't carry the yarn, send them our way, ask them for it, or you can always get in touch with directly and we can help you find a shop near you. Yeah.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Thank you. This was great.
Thanks to our sponsors for supporting the podcast. Thank you for listening to the Long Thread podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate the show and leave us a comment on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. Thanks again.